Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really crucial global question, the economic journey of middle-income countries.
Yeah, it's a big one.
We've sifted through a ton of research, looking at worldwide economic trends to try and bring you the core insights about the hurdles these nations face and maybe some smart moves they could make towards greater prosperity.
And this exploration is really for you, the listener. If you're keen to understand how the global economy works, but maybe without getting totally buried in data and numbers,
Right.
our aim is to highlight what truly matters, connect the dots in a way that, well, makes sense, and hopefully give you those aha moments that deepen your understanding of the world around us.
And one big question just kept popping up from all the sources we looked at. Is it actually getting tougher for middle-income countries to break through that ceiling and achieve high-income status? That's kind of the puzzle we're going to unpack today. We'll look at the key factors involved and the strategies being suggested to navigate these challenges. Okay, so to maybe kick things off, one of the central ideas our sources really hammer home is this concept of the middle-income trap.
Exactly. And, while the term itself isn't new, it's been around since about 2007, maybe a bit earlier, the current global landscape seems to make escaping this trap feel significantly more daunting. That's a word the sources use quite a bit.
Daunting, okay.
Yeah. And the crucial takeaway here isn't just about, getting stuck. It's that the very strategies that fueled a country's initial growth, they can actually become the obstacles to moving further up.
Huh. So what worked before doesn't necessarily work later.
Precisely. It's not like it's an inevitable fate, getting trapped, but it really demands that these countries actively reshape their policies and their institutions. You can't just keep doing the same thing.
Okay, so it's not a dead end, but more like a fork in the road where you need a completely new map.
That's a good way to put it.
So what are some of the key directions, then, that our sources suggest for avoiding getting stuck in that middle gear?
Well, the research points to three really broad priorities for escaping the trap. First, getting a handle on entrenched interests, the status quo players.
Okay.
Second, really rewarding talent and effort merit, essentially. And third, and this might sound a bit counterintuitive, strategically using crises as actual opportunities for change.
Crises as opportunities. Interesting.
Yeah, we'll definitely dig into each of those. But maybe first we need to understand the fundamental shifts in growth strategy these countries need to engineer.
Shifts. Okay, tell me more. Are we talking about big changes in how their economies fundamentally operate?
We are. Our sources lay out two key transitions, one after the other, that middle-income countries generally need to navigate.
Two transitions. Got it.
The first one is moving from a strategy that's focused mainly on investment, just building stuff, basically, what's termed one-eye,
Okay, one,
to
two.
a two-eye strategy. And that combines investment with something they call infusion.
Infusion. Okay, that sounds interesting. What does that practically mean? Like, what is infusion?
So infusion, in essence, is all about smart learning and adaptation from what's happening globally. Best practices, It means actively seeking out, adopting, and then crucially, widely spreading foreign technology and established business practices within your own country.
Ah, okay. So it's like strategic imitation. Learning from the best and then making it work locally.
Exactly. It's not just blind copying. It's smart adaptation and then really making those borrowed ideas your own, building capability around them.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like learn the roles, then adapt them. Are there examples of countries that have actually done this well, made that leap from just investing to also strategically infusing?
Oh, absolutely. South Korea is a classic example, especially in its earlier development stages. They strategically adopted technologies, largely from Japan, actually.
Right.
Chile offers another really compelling case. They adapted Norwegian salmon farming techniques to their own coastal conditions.
They became huge exporters, didn't they?
Became a massive global player, exactly. Then there's Poland, especially after joining the EU. They really leveraged the supply chains of multinational corporations setting up there. That was a form of infusion.
Okay.
And even way back, Japan, during the Meiji Restoration, proactively importing things like telecommunications tech from the U.S.
So the common thread seems to be that smart adaptation you mentioned, tailoring it to the local situation and building up local skills around it.
Precisely. Smart adoption and then building your own strength from that imported foundation.
What are the really crucial ingredients, then, for this infusion process to actually work, to take hold?
Well, a skilled workforce is absolutely fundamental. You need people who can understand and implement these foreign technologies and practices.
Makes sense.
So, strong secondary education and especially good vocational training systems are vital for producing those technically capable workers.
Right, the people who can actually do the adapting and implementing.
Exactly. And interestingly, our sources highlight that STEM graduates, science, tech, engineering, math, they're increasingly concentrated in middle-income countries now, which actually presents a potentially significant advantage for this infusion stage if they can harness it.
Okay, so investment plus the strategic infusion gets you moving forward. That's 2I. What's the next big step in this economic development story, according to the sources?
The second key transition is then moving from that 2I strategy to a 3I strategy.
Okay, let me guess. Investment, infusion, and innovation.
You got it.
Yeah.
This builds on both investment and infusion by adding that critical third element, homegrown innovation.
So it's evolving from adopting others' ideas to actually generating your own cutting-edge technologies, your own unique business practices.
Precisely. But this move towards really focusing on innovation, it demands a much more mature and supportive environment. It's a heavier lift.
How so? What kind of environment?
Our sources really emphasize the need for stronger institutions, freer economies, definitely respect for human rights, and also the development of livable cities. These things create the soil where innovation can actually take root and flourish.
That sounds like a pretty significant jump in complexity. Is there a danger in trying to become, an innovation hub too soon before you've really nailed the infusion part?
There absolutely is. Our sources point quite clearly to the cautionary tale of Latin America in some respects.
Oh.
Yeah, prematurely focusing on innovation without first successfully building that really solid base through infusion, it can actually backfire. It can be detrimental and hinder progress.
So you really need that foundation of adapted knowledge to effectively build upon and then innovate yourself.
Exactly. You need to get good at using the world's knowledge before you can realistically expect to add significantly to it. Learn to walk well before you try to sprint, essentially.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, so we've got these transitions countries need to make. Now, our sources also talk about these shrinking spaces that are making growth even more challenging now for middle-income countries. What exactly are these constraints?
Yeah, it's like the external environment is getting tougher. Several interconnected factors are creating these tighter spaces. One really major issue is the increasing restrictions we're seeing in foreign trade and investment.
Globalization maybe going into reverse a bit.
Something like that. Geopolitical tensions, the rise of populism, they're definitely playing a role. And the data is pretty stark. Harmful trade policies around the world now actually outnumber helpful ones. And interventions specifically targeting, say, the semiconductor trade, they've just skyrocketed since 2019. So that openness that fueled growth before, it feels like it's constricting.
That definitely paints a picture of a global economy becoming less open, less frictionless than maybe we've seen in recent decades.
Yeah.
What are some other aspects of these shrinking spaces?
Well, rising levels of debt are another huge concern. Most developing economies are facing, frankly, more severe levels of indebtedness than really ever before.
And rising interest rates globally don't help that, I imagine.
Exactly. Increasing borrowing costs just exacerbate this, making it much, much harder to manage those debts and invest in the future.
Okay, so trade issues, debt issues, what else?
The third big one is the urgent need for climate action. Now, obviously, this is absolutely vital for everyone long term.
Of course.
But in the shorter term, it does present economic hurdles. It requires really substantial upfront investments in new kinds of infrastructure, or, green infrastructure, plus significant regulatory changes.
Those can be disruptive.
They can be. These shifts, while essential for sustainability down the road, could potentially slow down productivity growth in the near term as economies adjust. And on top of that, the actual cost of capital, the cost of borrowing money for renewable energy projects tends to be higher in low and middle income countries.
So it's more expensive for them to make the green transition even if it's necessary.
Right. It creates another financial barrier they have to overcome.
So it really is a confluence of factors: trade, debt, climate transition costs, making that climb to high income status even steeper than it used to be.
That's the picture the sources paint, yes.
Now, you mentioned creative destruction earlier as part of the solution. It sounds a bit dramatic. What role does that play in all of this?
It might sound dramatic, but creative destruction is actually seen as a crucial engine for economic progress. It fuels growth through both that infusion process, bringing in foreign knowledge, and generating local innovation.
Okay, so what is it exactly?
It's basically the continuous process where new ideas, new technologies, new businesses emerge, and in doing so, they naturally replace older, less efficient ones.
So it's about the economy constantly refreshing itself, the out with the old, in with the new principle, driving efficiency gains.
Exactly. And the modern understanding isn't just about new firms killing old ones. It emphasizes that both new companies, the entrants, and established companies, the incumbents, create value. And importantly, they push each other to get better through competition. In fact, a really significant chunk, the sources estimate somewhere between 50 and 70% of overall productivity growth, actually comes from this constant reallocation. Resources shifting from less productive firms to more productive ones, regardless of whether they're old or new.
But if this process is so vital for growth, why isn't it happening more effectively in many of these middle-income countries? What's blocking it?
Well, our sources point to several key roadblocks. A major one is often resistance from powerful incumbents.
These established players.
Exactly. This
Okay.
could be large corporations, maybe state-owned enterprises, or even influential, wealthy individuals who benefit massively from keeping the existing system just the way it is.
They have a vested interest in not being creatively destroyed, I suppose.
Precisely. They have a strong incentive to prevent changes that might disrupt their dominance, their market share, their profits.
No.
And on top of that, sometimes weak institutions or just outdated policies can unintentionally protect these older ways of doing things, effectively shielding incumbents and hindering this natural, healthy process of creative destruction.
It's quite sobering, isn't it?
Hmm.
To think about these entrenched interests maybe actively holding back progress for the wider economy.
It is. And it's not just theoretical. You can see signs of this lack of creative destruction on the ground.
Like what?
Well, there's this phenomenon called flat and stay dynamics.
Flat and stay.
Yeah. In many middle-income countries, the sources mention India, Mexico, Peru as examples. You see a very large number of firms that just stay really small.
Yeah.
They remain micro-enterprises, basically, without experiencing significant growth over time.
Why is that?
It's often due to things like market distortions, maybe unfair competition, or really high regulatory costs and red tape that make it incredibly difficult for the more efficient, promising firms to actually expand, to scale up. And if they can't scale up, they can't displace the less efficient ones.
So you end up with lots of tiny players, but not enough dynamic growth and market disruption driven by the best performers.
That's the picture, yeah. A lack of dynamism.
Okay, this connects directly to one of those priorities you mentioned earlier. Disciplining incumbency. If incumbents are often the roadblock, how can middle-income countries actually achieve that? How do you discipline them?
Well, the core issue, as we said, is that these powerful incumbents can use their influence in all sorts of ways. They can stifle competition. They can actively block new businesses from even entering the market.
Like you mentioned, state-owned energy companies may be blocking renewables.
Exactly like that. That's a classic example. They can also just generally reduce the incentives for anyone, including themselves, sometimes to innovate. Why bother innovating if you're protected?
Right.
And sometimes market leaders might even find it more profitable to invest in political connections, lobbying, rather than actually investing in developing better products or services. The sources mention Italy as a place where this has been observed.
So it really comes down to creating a more level playing field, preventing these powerful players from using their weight to unfairly tilt the rules of the game in their favor.
That's the essence of it.
So what are some concrete actions countries can take to discipline them?
The research suggests focusing on promoting what are called contestable markets.
Contestable markets.
Yeah, think of it as making sure that, in principle, anyone with a good idea and the capability can actually enter a market and compete fairly. It's about reducing those built-in unfair advantages that established players often have that block newcomers.
Okay, how do you make markets more contestable?
It involves a mix of policies, things designed to weaken those forces that preserve the status quo, strengthen the forces that encourage new businesses and innovation, and sometimes specifically targeting harmful actions by dominant incumbents.
So weakening the old guard, strengthening the newcomers.
In a way, yes. This includes things like actively reducing the protection given to incumbents, and that includes state-owned enterprises. removing unnecessary licenses, getting rid of outdated regulations that serve no purpose other than protecting incumbents.
Cutting red tape that benefits the established players.
Exactly. And the sources note that surprisingly restrictive rules about what businesses can do and how they operate what they call product market regulations, or PMRs, are actually really widespread in middle-income countries and are a key area to address.
So, using less restrictive rules, what else does a more contestable environment look like on the ground?
Well, it would involve things like ensuring everyone has fair and non-discriminatory access to essential infrastructure, think ports, broadband, that sort of thing. Creating open electricity markets is another big one, allowing different energy providers, including renewables, to compete fairly based on cost and efficiency, and just generally reducing the amount of bureaucratic hassle businesses have to navigate.
Beyond those economic policies, is there anything else?
Yes, absolutely. Addressing social norms is also seen as crucial. For example, challenging traditional patriarchal gender norms can significantly increase the number of women participating in the workforce, which brings in new talent, new skills, new perspectives. Huge potential boost.
Right. Unleashing more talent.
Also, actively tapping into the knowledge and networks of people who have emigrated from the country, the diaspora. They can be a really valuable source of insights, investment, and connections back to global markets.
That's interesting. Leveraging the diaspora.
And finally, a really important piece is actively tackling anti-competitive practices head-on. Things like cartels colluding to fix prices, or dominant companies abusing their market power.
Why is that so critical?
Because these practices directly harm a country's ability to compete internationally. They hurt consumers, they can lower wages, and they definitely stifle innovation. We see examples of this being a major problem in places like Latin America.
And are the authorities equipped to handle this?
Often, unfortunately, no. It's worth noting that the government agencies responsible for ensuring fair competition, the competition authorities in many middle-income countries, often lack the necessary funding, the staff, and sometimes the political independence to be truly effective. That's another institutional area needing strengthening.
Wow. Okay. That's a really comprehensive set of actions for disciplining incumbency. Now, the second big priority you mentioned was rewarding merit. How can middle-income countries do a better job of that? And maybe clarify what we mean by merit here.
Sure. So when we talk about rewarding merit in this context, we basically mean ensuring that opportunities for education, for jobs, for advancement are primarily based on an individual's talent, their effort, their skills, not on, who their parents are, who they know, or what advantages they happen to be born with.
Right. Making it about capability, not connections or background.
Exactly. And the policy focus here, according to the sources, should really be on enhancing mobility, both social mobility, moving up the ladder, and economic mobility, rather than just focusing narrowly on, say, how income is redistributed after the fact.
Okay, so creating pathways for talent to rise. Where does that start?
Well, a fundamental part of it is building strong foundational skills for everyone. Broadening access to genuinely quality basic education for all children is absolutely key.
Quality being the operative word there.
Definitely. And we can actually learn from countries like Finland and Chile, which have made successful strides in this area. Interestingly, the research suggests it's not always about just throwing more money at the education system.
Oh.
It's often more about spending the money you do have more efficiently and effectively, focusing on teacher quality, on curriculum, on ensuring basic literacy and numeracy are solid.
So smarter spending for better foundational skills. Makes sense. What else is important for truly rewarding merit beyond just basic schooling?
Improving the transition from education into the workforce is crucial. Getting that first job, making it relevant.
The school-to-work pipeline.
Exactly. This can involve bringing much more real-world work experience into the education system itself. Things like dual training programs where you learn and work, apprenticeships, co-op models. We see examples of these being used in countries like Brazil, South Africa, Turkey.
Getting practical experience alongside theoretical learning?
Right. Or even more integrated school curriculums that explicitly connect learning to workforce needs, like Indonesia's Merdeka Belajar Freedom to Learn initiative aims to do.
And ensuring the skills taught actually match what employers need.
Absolutely critical. You need mechanisms to align skill supply with demand. Encouraging industries to collaborate closely with technical and vocational education and training TVET programs is vital. Denmark's model of using local advisory councils with industry input is often cited as a good example here.
So getting employers involved in shaping the training, what about identifying and supporting the most talented individuals? How does
Yeah, good.
meritocracy handle that?
That's also vital. But the sources suggest a nuanced approach. We need to move beyond relying solely on, say, standardized exam scores as the only definition of merit.
Look broader than just test results.
Yes, consider a broader range of talents, skills, and potential. And importantly, this also means providing targeted support for people coming from disadvantaged backgrounds to make sure they have a fair shot at demonstrating their talents and succeeding.
Leveling the playing field somewhat.
Exactly. Things like Brazil's affirmative action policies in higher education, or programs like the top 10% automatic admission rule used in some U.S. states, are examples of trying to achieve this. The overall goal should be striving for high-quality education across all types of educational institutions, not just a select few elite ones.
And nurturing those who really excel.
Yes, that's important too. Having special programs designed to challenge and support gifted students is also part of a comprehensive merit-based system. We see these in developed countries, of course, but also emerging in places like Colombia and Mexico.
Okay. What about the connection between universities and actual economic activity, like industry?
Strengthening those university industry links is seen as incredibly important, especially for driving that infusion and innovation we talked about earlier.
How can that be done?
Well, through smarter public funding for R&D, focusing on strategic areas like STEM fields, health, the energy transition, providing tax incentives for companies to collaborate with universities on research, like Sri Lanka has done.
Encouraging them to work together?
Exactly. And establishing dedicated technology transfer offices, or TTOs, within universities to help commercialize research findings. Brazil's Unicamp is a good example there. Plus, creating science and technology parks or incubators physically close to universities to foster collaboration.
Creating ecosystems for innovation. Now, how does the idea of business dynamism fit into this picture of rewarding merit?
Business dynamism, which is really that up or out process we discussed with creative destruction, where successful, efficient firms grow and less productive ones shrink or exit, that's a key way that merit gets rewarded in the actual marketplace.
So the most capable firms succeed.
Ideally, yes. And policies should support this natural selection process. The sources caution against providing just blanket support to all small businesses, regardless of their potential or performance.
Why is that? Doesn't everyone want to support small business?
Well, while politically popular, providing indiscriminate support can sometimes actually prop up unproductive firms and hinder overall productivity growth. We see evidence suggesting this might be the case in places like Sri Lanka, Vietnam, Mexico, even Japan historically.
Interesting. So support should be smarter, more targeted.
Possibly. Or focused more on removing barriers to growth for all firms rather than just subsidizing existence. Facilitating market-driven structural change is key. Spain's experience opening up its auto industry to foreign direct investment back in the day, while also setting performance requirements for those investors, is cited as a positive example of managing such a shift.
Okay. Any other aspects of the business environment relevant to rewarding merit?
Yes, improving corporate governance is important. Things like addressing the potential negative impact of dominant family control on professional management quality.
Ensuring companies are run based on competence, not just family ties.
Right. And strengthening shareholder protection rights can also encourage better management and more efficient allocation of capital. Finally, actively connecting entrepreneurs with the resources they need is crucial.
Funding and support for startups.
Exactly. Addressing common problems like lack of information entrepreneurs, not knowing where to find help or markets, and lack of collateral for loans, there's often a paradox. Lots of apparent opportunity, but relatively low rates of ambitious entrepreneurship.
Why is that?
Part of it is the difficulty accessing finance. Developing deeper venture capital and private equity markets is really important here, as these are often lacking in emerging economies. And also supporting things like business accelerators. They function almost like schools for entrepreneurs, providing mentorship, networks, and skills. Research from the Global Accelerator Learning Initiative, GALI, highlights their potential impact.
That's a lot of interconnected pieces, isn't it? Educations, skills, finance, governance, all needing to work together to truly reward merit and drive that economic progress.
It really is a systemic challenge. No single silver bullet.
Okay, let's move to the third priority you outlined, capitalizing on crises, and specifically the climate and energy crises. Now, this sounds intriguing. How can these huge, seemingly negative global situations actually be turned into opportunities for middle-income countries?
Well, the thinking is that crises, disruptive as they are, can sometimes act as powerful triggers for change. They can weaken those entrenched interests, those preservation forces we talked about, that normally resist reform.
They shake things up, basically, create
Yeah,
open.
exactly. They can open up windows of opportunity for quite significant reforms that might be politically impossible in normal times. And the climate and energy crises in particular are driving incredibly rapid technological advancements, especially in low-carbon technologies.
Right, like renewables, batteries, etc.
Precisely. So middle-income countries have a real chance here to, as the sources put it, globalize decarbonization.
Globalized decarbonization. What does that mean?
It means they can leapfrog older, dirtier technologies by actively adopting these new green technologies. That's the infusion part again. And potentially, they can become significant producers of green intermediate goods or final products for global markets.
So become part of the green supply chain.
Exactly. But, and this is important, this will likely require countries in the G20 and OECD, the wealthier nations, to reduce any protectionist green industrial policies they might be tempted to put in place. Policies that might inadvertently block middle-income countries from participating in these new green markets.
So avoiding green protectionism is key for everyone to benefit. Makes sense. What else can middle-income countries do specifically in response to these climate and energy crises?
Well, massively expanding their own infrastructure for low-carbon energy is crucial. Renewables, efficient grids, etc. This involves carefully evaluating the broader benefits to society, the social rate of return of these big infrastructure investments, maybe comparing that to what private companies or foreign investors alone might deliver.
Looking beyond just private profit.
Yes. And the good news is that in many middle-income countries, expanding renewable energy sources like solar and wind is already the most economically efficient option in the long run. The challenge, as we mentioned, is often the high upfront capital cost.
And those hurdles for investment you mentioned.
Right. Overcoming obstacles for both domestic and foreign investment in renewables, things like complex permitting processes, grid connection issues, is really vital.
And what about those incumbents again? The state-owned energy companies.
Getting a handle on them is critical here too. Addressing situations where established players, often state-owned enterprises heavily invested in fossil fuels, might be actively blocking the entry and growth of renewable energy competitors.
Disciplining incumbency in the energy sector specifically.
Exactly. And ensuring that electricity markets operate efficiently, respecting the merit order, which means dispatching power from the cheapest sources first. Given their near-zero fuel costs, that often means prioritizing renewables when they're available.
Okay. And carbon pricing.
Implementing carbon pricing mechanisms, whether taxes or emissions trading systems, is another important step the sources highlight to make sure the price of energy reflects its true environmental costs.
It sounds like a really significant overhaul of how energy markets are structured and regulated is needed in many places.
It often is, yes.
What about the bigger picture challenge of decoupling economic growth from rising carbon emissions?
Yeah.
How are middle-income countries doing on that front?
This is a major, major challenge. While many high-income countries have managed to reduce their overall emissions somewhat, mainly by becoming much more energy efficient.
Using less energy per unit of GDP.
Right. But in most middle-income countries, economic growth itself is still the primary driver pushing emissions up. So as their economies grow, their emissions tend to grow too.
Which isn't sustainable globally.
No. If current policies and trends continue, the emissions growth from these countries risks blowing past global carbon budgets needed to limit climate change.
Is there any precedent for this kind of shift?
Well, it's worth remembering that past energy crises, like the oil shocks in the 1970s, actually spurred significant innovation in energy efficiency and renewables, particularly in wealthier nations at the time.
Necessity being the mother of invention.
Something like that. And we're seeing a similar, perhaps even faster, acceleration in the development and diffusion of low-carbon technologies right now.
Really? Is it happening globally?
Yes. The sources point to rapid growth in jobs related to clean energy, a huge increase in companies talking about and investing in these technologies, especially after the shocks from the war in Ukraine and major policy shifts like the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, and the EU's Repower EU plan.
So those policies are having an impact.
It seems so. We're seeing new geographic clusters of green innovation popping up, lots of new startups, new sources of finance emerging, all focused on low-carbon solutions.
And are middle-income countries part of this acceleration?
They are, which is encouraging. The growth rates for the adoption of key clean energy technologies like solar PV, wind power, electric vehicles are now actually higher in middle-income countries than in high-income ones.
Oh, that's significant.
It is. However, the overall level of adoption, the installed base, is still much lower. So they're catching up fast in percentage terms, but starting from a smaller base.
Okay, so progress, but still a long way to go.
Yeah.
What are the main barriers holding back even faster adoption of these clean technologies in middle-income countries?
Several things. Old power grids, legacy transmission networks that were designed for big, centralized fossil fuel power plants, often struggle to integrate large amounts of variable renewable energy like solar and wind.
Infrastructure mismatch.
Right. Outdated regulations that weren't designed for this new energy reality are another big one. Integrating renewables effectively, electrifying other sectors like transportation and buildings. It all requires really complex, system-wide coordination.
Which requires capable institutions.
Absolutely. Strong government agencies with the technical expertise and authority to manage this complex transition are essential. And finally, something we can't forget is the importance of managing just transitions.
Just transitions, meaning
Meaning managing the shift away from jobs and economic activity dependent on fossil fuels in a way that's fair and minimizes social disruption for the workers and communities affected.
helping people move from coal mining to solar installation, for example.
Ideally, yes. Though the reality currently, according to the data, is that most workers transitioning out of carbon-intensive jobs are actually moving to other carbon-intensive jobs or maybe into general manufacturing rather than directly into new green jobs. So making that transition truly just and effective remains a major challenge.
This has been a really, really insightful deep dive into the complex world of economic development for middle-income countries. Let's maybe try to summarize some of the key takeaways here. We've definitely seen that the path from middle income to high income status is certainly complex. It faces some significant headwinds right now, those shrinking spaces we discussed.
Definitely not straightforward. However, I think the overall message from our sources isn't one of despair. It's actually cautiously one of hope, or at least possibility.
Right.
By strategically focusing on that infusion, bringing in global knowledge effectively by fostering creative destruction, allowing a dynamic economy where new ideas can thrive by actively disciplining incumbency, managing the influence of entrenched interests, and by consistently rewarding merit, developing and deploying talent effectively,
Yeah.
real progress is absolutely possible.
So those key priorities we discussed are the levers.
They seem to be the core levers, yes. And interestingly, the climate crisis, while undeniably a massive global threat, also presents some genuinely unique opportunities for innovation, for investment, and for sustainable growth if navigated wisely.
So for you, our listener, hopefully, you now have a much deeper, more nuanced understanding of the intricate forces shaping global economic development today, and maybe a clearer picture of the specific policy tools and strategies that can potentially empower middle-income countries to not just navigate these challenges, but to actually thrive in the years ahead.
And maybe that brings us to a final thought for you to ponder on your own. Considering just how interconnected our global economy truly is, how might the success or perhaps the struggle of middle-income countries in navigating these incredibly complex transitions ultimately impact your own future and the stability of the world we all share?